Sometimes the things we save end up saving us right back. When 73-year-old Silas Boone found a donkey foal crying over its mother's lifeless body in the scorched desert, he was a man who had given up on everything: family, purpose, even himself. The old cowboy had been drifting toward the end, carrying wounds no doctor could heal, but that small creature, trembling and alone, refused to let him disappear. Silas named her Mercy, and what started as one act of compassion became something neither of them expected: a second chance at living. Together, they would walk a path that transformed a hollow man and a helpless animal into something the town had never seen. How does a broken cowboy and an orphaned foal teach an entire community what it means to start over? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The saddle had been with Silas Boone for 40 years. It sat now across the back of his mare, Dusty, worn smooth in places where his weight had pressed leather against leather through thousands of miles. The pommel bore scratches from fence wire and brush, and the seat had molded itself to the shape of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off. The stirrups hung at exactly the right length, adjusted so many times over the decades that Silas no longer thought about them. They just fit. The leather smelled of sweat and dust and oil, a scent that meant work and purpose, and all the years he'd spent building a life. It was the one thing Silas refused to sell, even when he'd sold everything else. He'd let go of the ranch 6 months back. Couldn't work it alone anymore. Not at 73. Not with knees that complained every morning and hands that sometimes forgot their strength. The buyer had been fair. A young family with 3 children who promised to keep the place running proper. Silas had signed the papers without ceremony, taken his money, and ridden away before they moved in. He didn't want to see other people's children running through rooms where his own daughter had grown up. Didn't want to watch someone else's life begin where his had ended. That had been the pattern these last months. Selling off, letting go, moving on. The truck went next, then the tools, then most of his clothes except what fit in 2 saddlebags. He kept a bedroll, a canteen, some jerky and hardtack, and the old Colt revolver his father had carried in the war. Everything else felt like weight he didn't need anymore. Dusty plodded beneath him now, across a landscape that looked like God had started creating it, and then lost interest halfway through. The desert stretched in all directions, flat and colorless except where the heat made it shimmer and dance. Creosote bushes dotted the cracked earth, their roots digging deep for water that might not even be there. The sun pressed down on his shoulders, like a physical thing, and Silas tilted his hat lower to keep the glare from his eyes. His shirt stuck to his back, and sweat traced lines down his weathered face. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular. That was the honest truth of it. He'd left Copper Falls 3 days ago and pointed Dusty west because that's where the dirt road went. No plan, no destination, just the notion that if he kept moving, maybe the things chasing him inside his head would tire out and leave him be. Maybe if he rode far enough, he'd find some kind of peace. Or maybe he'd just ride until there was nothing left to ride toward. 5 years since Clara died. 5 years of waking up to an empty bed and cooking breakfast for one and talking to himself because there wasn't anyone else to talk to. People said time healed all wounds, but Silas figured those people hadn't lost the one person who made sense of their whole life. Time didn't heal anything. It just put distance between you and the last moment you felt whole. It just made the memories further away, harder to touch, until you started forgetting the sound of her voice or the exact way she smiled. Clara had been his balance. Where he was quiet, she filled the silence with stories and laughter that could light up a whole room. Where he saw problems, she saw possibilities and solutions he'd never have thought of on his own. She'd kept the books for the ranch, handled the phone calls with buyers, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and went to plant the vegetables in the garden behind the house. She'd been the reason he got up in the morning and the reason he looked forward to coming home at night. Without her, the ranch had just been land and animals and work. Without her, everything had lost its color. The cancer took her in 6 months, started in her lungs, and spread like wildfire before anyone knew it was there. By the time the doctors in Albuquerque figured it out, there wasn't much they could do but make her comfortable and try to buy her a little more time. Silas sat beside her hospital bed for those last weeks, holding her hand and telling her about the ranch, about the foal that had been born that spring, about the fence line he'd finally finished on the north pasture. She smiled and nodded, but he could see her slipping away, piece by piece, day by day, until one morning she squeezed his hand one last time and didn't squeeze again. He'd buried her in the cemetery outside Copper Falls, next to the plot he'd already bought for himself years ago when they were planning for the future. The headstone was simple granite. Clara Jean Boone, beloved wife and mother. He visited every Sunday for the first year, then every month, then whenever he happened to be in town and could bear it. Not because he forgot her or loved her less, but because standing at that grave just reminded him she was gone, and he didn't need any reminding. The missing was with him every moment of every day. The worst part came after. Emily, his daughter, had flown in from Seattle for the funeral. She was 42 now, married to a software engineer named Jake, who Silas had never quite understood. They had 2 children. Silas barely knew Sophie and Michael, 10 and 8. Emily had left home at 18, after a fight Silas couldn't even remember the details of anymore. Something about college, about the ranch, about him not understanding what she wanted from life. Something about him being too rigid, too set in his ways. They'd spoken maybe twice a year since then, awkward phone calls where neither of them knew what to say beyond the basics. How's the weather? How's work? The kids doing all right? Good, that's good. At Clara's funeral, Emily had tried to talk to him about moving to Seattle, about selling the ranch, about how he couldn't live alone at his age. She'd used words like practical and sensible and concerned. He'd listened, without saying much, nodding in the right places, then told her he'd think about it. But he never called her back, and she stopped calling him after a while. That was 2 years ago now. He figured she'd written him off as a stubborn old man who didn't want help, and maybe she was right. Maybe that's exactly what he was. The truth was, Silas didn't know what he wanted anymore. He just knew he couldn't stay in that house, couldn't keep waking up to reminders of a life that didn't exist anymore. Every room held memories. Every piece of furniture had a story. The kitchen table where they'd eaten breakfast together for 35 years. The rocking chair on the porch where Clara had sat in the evenings, watching the sunset and telling him about her day. The bed they'd shared, now too big and too empty, so he'd sold it all, packed what he could carry on Dusty, and started riding. Dusty's hooves crunched across the hardpan, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. She was a good horse, 17 years old and still strong, still willing. She'd been Clara's horse originally, a sorrel mare with a white blaze down her face and patient brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Clara had named her Dusty because she kicked up clouds of dirt when she ran across the pasture. Now she carried Silas without complaint, her ears flicking forward and back as they crossed the empty land, listening to sounds he couldn't hear. The desert had its own kind of beauty if you looked for it. Silas had spent enough time out here over the years to appreciate the subtle colors, the purple shadows of distant mountains, the silver green of sage, the rusty red of rock formations carved by wind and time. The way the light turned everything golden just before sunset, painting the world in shades of amber and honey. But today, he wasn't looking for beauty. He was just trying to get through one more day without thinking too hard about what came next. He'd camped rough the last 2 nights, bedroll on the ground beneath stars, so thick they looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. The silence out here was absolute, broken only by the occasional coyote howl or the rustle of something small moving through the brush. Silas didn't mind the silence. He'd grown accustomed to it, even comfortable with it. Silence didn't ask questions or expect answers. It didn't look at you with pity or concern. It just was, and there was something peaceful in that. His thoughts drifted as Dusty walked, the way they always did when there was nothing to occupy his hands. He thought about the ranch, about the mornings when he'd wake before dawn and walk out to check the horses, his breath steaming in the cold air. He thought about Clara standing at the stove making pancakes, her hair still messy from sleep, humming some tune he never knew the name of. He thought about Emily as a little girl, sitting on the fence rail and watching him work, asking 100 questions he didn't always have good answers for. Where do clouds come from? Why do horses sleep standing up? What happens when people die? Where had it all gone? How did a life that felt so full end up feeling so empty? How did you go from having everything that mattered to having nothing but memories and regrets? The sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down harder. Silas took a pull from his canteen, the water warm and metallic tasting. He should have filled it at the last creek, but he'd been distracted, thinking about other things. There'd be water ahead somewhere. There always was, if you knew where to look and didn't mind riding a ways to find it. Around midday, when the heat was at its worst and the air shimmered like water, he spotted something in the distance. Dark shapes on the ground, too still to be alive. Buzzards circled overhead in their slow, patient spirals, black silhouettes against the white-hot sky. Silas's first instinct was to give it a wide berth. Death in the desert was common enough, and there was no profit in investigating every carcass. Nature had its way of dealing with things, and it wasn't pretty, but it was efficient. But something made him urge Dusty forward anyway. Maybe curiosity, maybe just the need to see something other than empty land, maybe something he couldn't name. The shapes grew larger as they approached, resolving into detail. 2 donkeys, he could see now, a mare and what looked like a foal. The mare was on her side, clearly dead for at least a day, judging by the condition. Wild donkeys weren't uncommon out here, descendants of animals that had wandered off from miners and homesteaders a century ago. They survived in small bands, tough and resourceful, living on scrub and whatever water they could find. But the desert didn't forgive weakness or bad luck. Silas was about to turn Dusty away when he heard it, a sound that cut through the stillness like a knife through paper. A bray, high-pitched and desperate and full of a grief so raw it stopped him cold. The kind of sound that reached past your defenses and grabbed hold of something deep inside. The foal stood on top of its mother's body, wobbling on stick-thin legs that looked like they might buckle any moment. It was tiny, couldn't have been more than a few days old, still fuzzy with birth hair that stuck out in all directions. Its ears were too large for its head, and its eyes were dark and wide with confusion and fear. It brayed again, the sound echoing across the flats, carrying for miles in the thin desert air. Then it lowered its head and nuzzled its mother's neck, trying to wake her, trying to make her move. Silas felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been locked tight for 5 years. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, just watching. The foal didn't run. It just stood there on its dead mother, calling for her to wake up, to stand, to do something, anything. Its sides heaved with the effort, and Silas could see it trembling even from 20 feet away. How long had it been standing? There. How many hours or days had it cried for help that never came? He should ride on. That was the sensible thing, the practical thing. The foal wouldn't survive without its mother, not out here. It was too young, too weak. Nature would take its course in another day or two. He had nothing to offer it anyway. He was barely keeping himself going. Taking on a helpless animal made no sense at all. But he found himself dismounting anyway, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that sent up a small cloud of dust. Dusty stood still as he dropped the reins, ground-trained and patient as always. Silas walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty, speaking in a low voice, the way he'd always spoken to animals. "Easy now. Easy. I'm not going to hurt you. Just want to have a look." The foal watched him approach with those impossibly dark eyes, too big for its small face. It brayed again, softer this time, almost a question. "Are you here to help? Can you fix this?" Silas knelt a few feet away, ignoring the protest from his knees, and waited. Patience was something he'd learned over a lifetime of working with animals. You never rushed them. You let them come to you. The foal took a tentative step toward him, then another, unsteady but determined. When it was close enough to touch, it pressed its nose against his weathered hand, warm and soft and impossibly trusting. It made a small sound, deep in its throat, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, and leaned its weight against him. Silas felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Not at Clara's funeral, surrounded by neighbors and relatives. Not when he signed away the ranch, watching his life's work change hands. Not during any of the long nights alone when the missing felt like it might swallow him whole. But here, kneeling in the dirt beside a dead donkey and her orphaned baby, the tears came and wouldn't stop. He didn't know if he was crying for the foal, or for himself, or for Clara, or for everything he'd lost and everything he'd never have again. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was all the same grief, just different faces. He just let it happen, one hand stroking the foal's neck while it leaned against him, both of them shaking, both of them alone in the vastness of the desert. When the tears finally stopped, leaving his face sticky and his eyes burning, Silas sat back on his heels and really looked at the little creature. She, he could see now, it was a female, gazed back at him with those dark, trusting eyes, waiting for him to do something, to make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making any sense at all. He thought about riding away. He thought about the revolver in his saddlebag and the mercy of a quick death versus slow starvation. He thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea, about how he had no way to feed her properly, no plan, no destination, nothing to offer except whatever scraps of humanity he had left. He was a broken-down old man who'd given up on life. What business did he have trying to save anything? But when he stood up and walked back to Dusty, his legs stiff and his back aching, the foal followed him, stumbling, wobbling, but determined. And when he mounted and turned the mare's head west again, continuing his journey to nowhere, the foal stumbled along behind, matching his pace as best she could, refusing to be left alone. Silas didn't look back at the dead mare lying in the dust. He just rode, listening to the small hoofbeats struggling to match Dusty's longer stride, and wondered what in God's name he was doing. Wondered if maybe Clara was somewhere laughing at him, or maybe crying with him, or maybe just shaking her head at the stubborn old fool who couldn't walk away from something that needed him. The foal followed for 3 hours before she couldn't walk anymore. Silas heard the change in the rhythm of her hoofbeats, heard them slow, and then stop altogether. He turned in the saddle to see her standing on shaking legs, head hanging low, too exhausted to take another step. She looked at him with eyes that held no accusation, just acceptance. She'd tried her best, and her best had run out. Silas dismounted and looked at her, this scrawny little thing, covered in dust and dried milk and desperation. She'd followed him without question, trusting that he knew where they were going even though he didn't, trusting that he had a plan even though he'd never been more lost in his life. He thought about Clara, about what she would say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh, that warm, rolling laugh that always made everything seem less serious. She'd loved animals, especially the helpless ones, the ones that needed extra care. She would have scooped up this foal, without a second thought, would have already been figuring out how to feed her and where to keep her and what to name her. Silas pulled the bedroll off Dusty's back and fashioned a kind of sling with rope and canvas. It took some doing, his fingers fumbling with knots he'd tied 1,000 times, but he managed to lift the foal lighter than he expected, all legs and big eyes, and drape her across Dusty's withers in front of the saddle. The foal didn't fight. She just lay there, too tired to protest, her head resting against Dusty's warm neck. Silas climbed up behind his makeshift cargo, adjusted his seat to balance the extra weight, and nudged Dusty forward. The mare snorted but obeyed, her gait careful and measured beneath the unusual burden. Smart horse. She understood what was needed. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red and purple, Silas realized something important. He'd made a decision without meaning to. He'd taken responsibility for something other than himself. He'd chosen to try, even though trying might fail, even though caring meant risking more loss. The foal's breathing evened out as she fell asleep, exhausted beyond measure. Silas felt her small heartbeat against his leg, steady and strong despite everything she'd been through. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't alone. There was another living creature depending on him, needing him, trusting him to keep her alive. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that didn't seem like such a terrible thing. It didn't fill the hole Clara had left nothing ever would, but it was something, a purpose. A reason to keep going, a small life that needed him to be stronger than he felt. The saddle beneath him creaked familiar and comfortable, worn to fit him perfectly after 40 years. Ahead, the desert stretched endless and empty. Behind, the past lay still and unchangeable. And here, in this moment, an old cowboy and an orphaned foal traveled together into an uncertain future, both of them wounded, both of them surviving, both of them taking one more step forward, because it was the only direction left to go. The first town Silas came to was called Redemption, which struck him as either the universe having a sense of humor or some kind of sign he wasn't ready to think about yet. It wasn't much of a town, a main street with maybe a dozen buildings, a gas station that looked like it had been standing since the Depression, and a general store with faded advertisements for motor oil and soda pop painted on the weathered wood siding. A few houses scattered beyond the main drag, their yards dusty and spare, with pickup trucks parked in driveways and dogs sleeping in whatever shade they could find. He rode in just after sunset, the foal still draped across Dusty's withers, both horse and rider exhausted. The foal had woken an hour back and tried to struggle free, panicked and confused, but Silas had held her steady and spoken low until she settled again, her small body trembling against his arm. Now she watched the unfamiliar buildings with wary eyes, her oversized ears swiveling at every sound, a screen door closing, a dog barking somewhere, the tinny sound of a television through an open window. A man stood outside the general store, sweeping the wooden porch in that ritual way people do at the end of a day, even though the dust would just blow back tomorrow. He was maybe 60, lean and weathered like an old fence post, with a face that suggested he'd seen most things life had to offer and wasn't much impressed by any of them. He stopped sweeping when he saw Silas approach, leaning on his broom and studying the unusual sight. "Evening," Silas said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. The man leaned on his broom and took his time looking over the scene, the tired old cowboy, the exhausted horse, the foal sprawled in front of the saddle like a sack of grain. His eyes lingered on the foal for a moment, taking in the details, before returning to Silas's face. No judgment there, just assessment. "Evening yourself. That's an unusual way to transport livestock." "Found her in the desert," Silas said, his voice rough from not talking to anyone in days. "Mother didn't make it. She's too young to walk far." The man nodded slowly, as if this explained everything that needed explaining. As if finding dying things in the desert and deciding to save them was a reasonable way to spend your time. "You planning to keep her?" It was a fair question, and Silas didn't have a good answer ready. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on getting through the next hour, the next mile, keeping the foal alive from one moment to the next. "Haven't decided yet," he said finally. "Well, if you are, she's going to need milk. Goat milk works best for donkey foals when there's no mare available to nurse." He jerked his thumb toward the store behind him. "I've got some canned goat milk inside. Not ideal for the long term, but it'll do until you figure something else out," Silas felt. Something loosen in his chest, some tension he hadn't known he was carrying. Help. This stranger was offering help without asking for anything in return. "I'd appreciate that," he said, and meant it more than the simple words could convey. The man set his broom aside and extended a calloused hand. "Name's Henry Marsh. I run the store, and most everything else around here that needs running." Silas Boone. They shook Henry's grip firm and dry, the handshake of a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life. "Come on in. Let's see what we can do for your little friend there." Silas dismounted carefully, mindful of the foal's precarious position. When he lifted her down, she stood on wobbling legs for a moment before pressing close to his side, her nose pushing into his hip, seeking comfort and security. Together they followed Henry into the store, dusty ground tied outside where she could rest. The interior smelled of wood and dust and 100 things stored too long motor. Oil and leather goods and penny candy, and who knew what else. Shelves lined the walls floor to ceiling, stocked with an eclectic mix of goods that suggested the store served people who lived far from anywhere else and needed a little bit of everything. Canned foods, hardware, clothing, veterinary supplies, fishing gear, ammunition. A wood stove sat cold and dark in one corner, waiting for winter. A large orange cat dozed on the counter beside an old-fashioned cash register, and it opened one yellow eye to assess the newcomers before going back to sleep. Henry moved through the narrow aisles with practiced ease, his hands reaching for items without looking, knowing exactly where everything was kept. He pulled cans of goat milk from a high shelf and set them on the counter with a solid thunk. "You'll need bottles too. I've got some meant for calves that should work well enough." He added 2 large bottles to the growing pile, then reached for a bag of grain. "She's too young for solid food yet, but you'll need this in a few weeks when she starts transitioning. Better to have it on hand." Silas pulled out his worn leather wallet, the bills inside representing what was left of his life savings. "What do I owe you?" Henry waved him off with a gesture that said the matter was settled. "Pay me when you come back through. Right now, you'd better get some food into her before she gets any weaker. There's a stable behind the store, nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and fresh water. You're welcome to use it tonight. No charge. That's kind of you, not kindness, just common sense." Henry's eyes were steady and direct. "You try to ride any farther tonight, that foal won't make it, and I imagine you're pretty well done in yourself. A man's got to know when to stop pushing." Silas couldn't argue with that. He felt like he'd been pushing for 5 years straight, and he was tired right down to his bones. He gathered up the supplies, the weight of the cans, solid and real, in his arms, while Henry showed him out the back door to a small barn that had seen better days but was still sound and serviceable. 3 stalls, a tack room, and a hayloft above where pigeons cooed softly in the rafters. The smell of old hay and animals and leather was instantly familiar, comforting in a way Silas hadn't expected. Dusty got one stall with fresh hay and a bucket of cool water that she drank from gratefully. Silas set up his bedroll in another stall, and the foal stayed close the entire time, never more than a few feet away, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. When he sat down on the straw-covered floor to mix the milk, she pushed her nose into his lap, nuzzling at his hands with urgent curiosity. He poured the canned goat milk into one of the bottles, his hands surprisingly steady despite his exhaustion. He tested the temperature on the inside of his wrist, the way Clara used to do with formula for Emily when she was a baby, making sure it wasn't too hot or too cold. The memory came sharp and clear, Clara in the kitchen at 2 a.m, their newborn daughter crying, both of them exhausted but happy in that overwhelming way new parents are. He offered the bottle to the foal, and she sniffed it suspiciously at first, turning her head away and braying softly. But hunger won out over caution, and she latched onto the nipple and began to drink like she'd been doing it her whole life. Milk dribbled down her chin and onto Silas's dusty jeans, but he didn't care. He just held the bottle steady and watched her drink, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest, something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was. Purpose, maybe, or responsibility, or just the simple satisfaction of meeting a need. When she finished the first bottle, she butted her head against his shoulder, asking for more with the direct honesty of a young creature who knows only hunger and fullness, comfort and discomfort. He gave her a second bottle, then a third, until her belly was round and tight like a drum. She yawned hugely, showing small teeth and a pink tongue, then folded her impossibly long legs beneath her and lay down in the clean hay beside him. Within minutes, her eyes were closed, and her breathing had evened into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. Her sides rose and fell steadily, and one ear twitched occasionally as she dreamed of things he couldn't imagine. Silas sat with his back against the rough wooden wall of the stall, too tired to move even if he'd wanted to. Dusty munched hay contentedly in the next stall, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice and then fell silent. The barn smelled of animals and earth and old wood, familiar scents that brought back memories of better times, of mornings when he'd come out to feed the horses and Clara would bring him coffee in a thermos. He thought about what he'd done, truly thought about it for the first time since he'd knelt in the desert beside that dead mare. He'd taken on responsibility for a creature that needed constant care, that would tie him down to one place, that would make everything harder. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to find someone in town tomorrow who wanted a donkey, hand her over to people who knew what they were doing, who had the setup and the resources. Then ride on. Keep moving. Stay ahead of the grief that chased him. But even as he thought it, sitting there in the dim barn with the foal sleeping trustingly beside him, he knew he wouldn't do it. Not because it made sense, but because something about this small, helpless animal had reached past all his carefully constructed defenses and grabbed hold of something he thought had died with Clara. She needed him, and God help him, he needed that. Needed to be needed. Needed to have a reason to wake up tomorrow and the day after that. He reached out and rested his rough, calloused hand on the foal's warm side, feeling her breathe, feeling her alive and safe under his protection. The weight of that responsibility should have scared him. Instead, it felt like an anchor, holding him steady when everything else in his life had come loose and drifted away. Mercy, he said quietly into the darkness, trying the name out loud for the first time. It felt right somehow, appropriate for a creature who'd been granted mercy in the desert, and who was, whether she knew it or not, granting him mercy in return. I think I'll call you Mercy. The foal slept on, oblivious to her naming, her small body trusting and peaceful. Silas closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall. For the first time in months, maybe years, he slept without dreaming of empty houses and graves and all the things he'd lost. He slept without the weight of grief pressing on his chest like a stone. He just slept, and it was enough. Morning came too soon, announced by Mercy's demanding brays that echoed through the barn like an alarm clock with no off switch. Silas woke stiff and sore, his back protesting the hard ground despite the bedroll, his neck kinked from sleeping at an angle against the wall. Every joint seemed to have its own complaint to register as he pushed himself upright, feeling every one of his 73 years. Mercy stood over him, nudging his shoulder with her nose insistently, clearly expecting breakfast and not interested in excuses. Her energy amazed him. Yesterday she'd been too weak to walk, and now she was bouncing around the stall like she owned the place, full of life and demands. All right, he muttered, his voice rough with sleep. I hear you. Give me a minute here. He mixed another bottle with hands that were steadier this morning, the routine already becoming familiar. Mercy danced impatiently around his feet, nearly tripping him twice, making small, urgent sounds deep in her throat. When he finally got the bottle ready and offered it to her, she latched on eagerly and drank, like she'd never been fed in her life, her tail whisking back and forth with satisfaction. After feeding Mercy a second bottle and getting Dusty settled with hay and water, Silas walked back to the general store. The morning was cool and clear, the heat of yesterday not yet settled in. Henry was already open for business, standing behind the counter with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, and yesterday's newspaper spread out in front of him, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Morning," Henry said, looking up from the paper. "How'd your little one do overnight?" "Loud," Silas said, allowing himself a small smile. "But she drank well. 3 bottles this morning already. I need to settle up with you for yesterday." They worked through the bill, Henry writing figures on a piece of scrap paper with a pencil stub. Silas paid in cash from the roll he kept in his saddlebag, bills that represented the sale of everything he'd owned. Henry counted out change with meticulous care and handed it back. "You really planning to keep her?" Henry asked, the same question as last night but with different weight behind it now. This time it felt more like concern than curiosity. "Seems that way." Henry studied him for a moment, taking his measure the way you might assess whether a fence post would hold or a storm was likely to break. "It's not easy, raising an orphan. They need feeding every few hours at first, like a human baby, and they're prone to getting sick if you're not careful. Scours, pneumonia, all kinds of things that can take them fast. You're taking on a lot for a man traveling alone." "I know," Silas said simply. He did know. He'd raised horses and cattle over the years, had bottle-fed orphaned calves before. It was never easy, but knowing something was hard had never stopped him from doing what needed doing. Henry nodded, seeming to accept this. Then he pulled a piece of paper from under the counter and sketched a rough map with his pencil, the lines, quick and sure. "If you're serious about it, there's a woman about 10 miles north of here. Lives alone, raises goats. Name's Martha Collins. She might be willing to sell you fresh milk regular, better than the canned stuff for a growing foal in the long term. Goats produce milk pretty close to what a donkey mare would give." Silas studied the map, committing it to memory. 10 miles wasn't far, but it meant backtracking north when he'd been heading west. It meant changing his non-plan, such as it was. Still, if he was going to do this properly, he should do it right. "I appreciate the advice. One more thing," Henry added another mark to the map. "There's an old homestead about 5 miles west of Martha's place. Been abandoned for years, but last I heard the cabin's still standing, and there's a good spring nearby. If you're looking for somewhere to stop for a while, somewhere to let that foal grow stronger before you move on, it might suit your needs. Nobody's using it." "Why are you helping me?" Silas asked. It wasn't suspicion in his voice, just honest curiosity. He'd become accustomed to people keeping their distance, and this stranger's kindness felt unexpected. Henry smiled, a sad sort of smile that suggested he understood more than he was saying. "Had a dog once, years back. Found him on the highway, hit by a car and left to die. Everybody said to put him down. Said he'd never walk right again, but I took him home anyway. Nursed him through it. He lived another 12 years, and they were the best 12 years of my life. Best friend I ever had." He pushed the map across the counter. "Sometimes the things we save end up being the things that save us. Good luck, Silas Boone." Silas took the map and folded it carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. The paper was warm from Henry's hand. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." He returned to the barn and began the work of packing up. Mercy watched with interest as he rolled his bedroll and loaded his gear back onto Dusty, her curiosity evident in every movement. When he lifted her onto Dusty's withers again, she settled more easily this time, already learning the routine. Smart little thing. They left Redemption heading north, following Henry's directions. The landscape shifted slightly as they traveled, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The air smelled different here, less harsh and dusty, touched with the scent of green things growing. It was prettier country, more hospitable. The ride to Martha Collins's place took most of the morning, Silas keeping Dusty to an easy walk to spare the mare's strength with her double burden. Mercy dozed for part of the journey, her head resting against Dusty's neck, but woke when they approached the goat farm, her ears pricking forward with interest. Martha's property announced itself with a hand-painted wooden sign, Collins Goat Farm. A dirt road led to a small ranch house built of adobe and wood, practical and solid. Fenced pastures surrounded the house, and dozens of goats grazed contentedly, their bells tinkling softly. They looked up as Silas approached, their strange rectangular pupils watching with mild interest before they returned to their grazing. A woman emerged from the house before Silas had even dismounted, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who didn't waste time or motion. She was maybe 70 herself, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a long braid, and hands that looked like they'd worked every single day of their life. She carried herself straight despite her years, and her eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Silas, Dusty, and the Foal. "Help you?" Her voice was direct, no nonsense. "Name's Silas Boone. Henry Marsh down in Redemption said you might sell goat milk. I've got an orphan foal needs feeding regular." Martha walked closer, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She studied Mercy with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating animals. "Donkey. How old?" "Few days, I figure. Found her in the desert 2 days back. Mother was dead." "Let me see her." Silas lifted Mercy down, and the foal stood on shaky legs, while Martha ran her hands over her with gentle efficiency. She checked the legs for soundness, felt along the ribs, looked at eyes and ears and mouth, her fingers sure and knowledgeable. Mercy tolerated the examination with surprising patience, as if she understood this woman knew what she was doing. "She's dehydrated and underweight," Martha said finally, straightening up. "Nothing that can't be fixed with good care and proper feeding, but it'll take work and attention." She fixed Silas with a look that was probably meant to be stern, but held a hint of something softer underneath. "You know what you're doing?" "Learning as I go," Silas admitted. There was no point in pretending otherwise. That got him a sharp look, but Martha's expression softened slightly, approval showing in the corners of her eyes. "At least you're honest about it. Most men would pretend they know everything." She nodded once. Decision made. "All right, I'll sell you milk. Fresh is better than canned for a growing foal. You'll need to come by twice a day, at first morning and evening. $2 per gallon, and that's fair." "More than fair," Silas agreed. "There's more to it than just buying milk," Martha continued. "I want to see this foal every time you come by. I'll check her progress. Make sure you're not killing her with kindness or ignorance. I'll teach you what you need to know, but you have to be willing to listen and learn. Deal?" Silas extended his hand without hesitation. "Deal." They shook on it, her grip as firm as any man's, and Martha disappeared into the house. She returned a few minutes later with 2 glass jugs of fresh milk, still warm, and a stack of proper bottles meant for small animals. "These will work better than those calf bottles. Henry gave you the nipples are the right size for her mouth. And here," she handed him a worn paperback book, its cover creased and pages dog-eared from use. "This is about raising orphan livestock. Read it, follow it, don't improvise unless you know what you're doing." Silas took the book, genuinely touched by the gesture. The title read, "The Orphan Animal Handbook," and looked like it had been well used and well loved. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll take good care of it." "Don't thank me yet. You're about to learn that babies of any species are exhausting, no matter how cute they are." But there was something approving in her eyes as she watched him carefully secure the milk jugs and load Mercy back onto Dusty. "Come back tomorrow morning. We'll see how she's doing." Silas tipped his hat to her and turned Dusty west, following Henry's map toward the abandoned homestead. Mercy settled against the mare's neck, content and fed, and Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Purpose. Direction, the sense that he was moving towards something instead of just away from everything. The bottles clinked softly in his saddlebag as they rode, a gentle reminder of the responsibility he'd taken on and the commitment he'd made. 3 times a day, every day, that foal would need feeding. No days off, no breaks, no room for forgetting or putting it off. It was a lot for a man his age, a man who'd been planning to just fade away quietly. But as Mercy brayed softly and pressed closer to Dusty's warmth, Silas found he didn't mind the burden at all. Following Henry's map, Silas found the abandoned homestead just before noon, when the sun was high and hot. It sat in a small valley sheltered by gentle hills, covered in scrub and pinyon pine, a single-room cabin of weathered logs beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The roof sagged in a few places, but was mostly intact, and the stone chimney still stood. Straight and true, mortar crumbling in places, but the structure sound. Behind the cabin, the remains of a corral fence suggested someone had once kept animals here, living the same kind of life Silas had lived before everything fell apart. Silas dismounted and stood for a moment, just looking. The place had been empty for years, that much was obvious. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and one of the windows had lost its glass, leaving a dark rectangular opening like a missing tooth. But there was something solid about it, something that said it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and built to last. The logs were still tight, the foundation level, the whole structure positioned to catch morning sun and afternoon shade. He unloaded his gear and set Mercy down in the long grass. The foal immediately began exploring with the fearless curiosity of the very young, her nose investigating every plant and rock within reach, her ears swiveling to catch every sound. Dusty drank deeply from the creek, then found a patch of grass to graze, her tail swishing lazily at flies. Silas walked through the cabin slowly, assessing the damage and what would need to be done. Someone had lived here once, had made a home. There were still remnants of that life, a rusted cook stove in one corner, a rough wooden table missing one leg, a chair with 3 good legs and 1 broken. A few mason jars lined a shelf, dusty and empty. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by years of feet walking the same paths. Sunlight streamed through the broken window and the holes in the roof, making patterns on the floor. It wasn't much, but it had water, shelter, and enough flat ground for a temporary camp. More importantly, it felt quiet in a way that settled something inside Silas's chest, something that had been tight and anxious for longer than he cared to think about. The creek made soft sounds over the rocks, and birds sang in the trees, and there was a peacefulness here that reminded him of better times. He spent the afternoon making the place livable. First, he patched the worst holes in the roof, using fallen branches and the canvas from his bedroll, climbing up carefully and trying not to think about how his balance wasn't what it used to be. Then he cleared debris from inside the cabin, old leaves, broken glass, the remains of a bird's nest, all swept out with a makeshift broom made from bundled grass. The space revealed itself slowly, showing its bones, and Silas could see it had been a decent home once. Someone had cared about this place. He found the stone fireplace still functional, the flue clear enough to draw air. He'd be able to cook here, to keep warm when the desert nights turned cold. The thought of staying that long through temperature changes and seasons surprised him. He'd been thinking in terms of days, maybe a week or 2. But now, looking at what could be done with a little work, he found himself thinking further ahead. Behind the cabin, he discovered the old corral fence in better shape than he'd first thought. Many of the posts were still solid, driven deep into the ground by someone who'd known their business. He spent an hour rebuilding a section using old wire he found coiled in the weeds and some fallen posts that could still serve. It wouldn't hold a determined horse, but it would keep Mercy from wandering off at night, and that's what mattered. By evening, he had something resembling a camp. The cabin was clean and dry, the worst roof holes patched. The corral would keep Mercy safe. There was water from the creek and grazing for Dusty. It was more than he'd had in months, more than a bedroll under the stars, more than constant moving with no place to rest. That night, he fed Mercy her bottles by the light of a small fire outside the cabin, watching her drink greedily. She'd already grown comfortable with the routine, knew the sound of milk being poured into the bottle, came running when she heard it. When she finished, she curled up in the hay he'd spread in one corner of the rebuilt corral, her sides rising and falling with deep, contented breaths. Silas sat by the fire with Martha's book open on his lap, reading by the flickering light. The book was practical and thorough, covering everything from feeding schedules to common illnesses, to how much exercise a growing foal needed at different stages. He read about scours and colic and respiratory infections, about hoof care and dental development and socialization needs. The author wrote in clear, direct language that assumed the reader was intelligent but might not know much about livestock. It was exactly what Silas needed. He read late into the night, his mind soaking up information the way the dry ground soaked up water. He learned that donkey foals needed to be fed every 3 to 4 hours for the first few weeks, then gradually transitioned to longer intervals. He learned the signs of dehydration and illness to watch for. He learned that orphaned animals often formed intense bonds with their caregivers and needed careful handling to prevent them from becoming too dependent or too wild. When he finally set the book aside and lay down in the cabin on his bedroll, the fire outside burning down to coals, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, that was too big a word for what he felt, but something like the possibility of hope, the sense that maybe things could be different, could be better, if he was willing to try. Outside, Mercy made a small sound in her sleep, and Silas smiled in the darkness. "We'll figure it out," he whispered to the empty cabin, to the foal sleeping safe in the corral, to Clara's memory if she was listening. "One day at a time. That's all we can do." The next morning came with birdsong and the sound of the creek and Mercy's insistent braying demanding breakfast. Silas woke feeling more rested than he had in months, despite the hard floor. He fed Mercy, then rode to Martha's place for fresh milk, leaving the foal safe in the corral where she couldn't follow. Martha was waiting when he arrived, and she checked Mercy over with careful attention during his evening visit, running her hands along the foal's sides, checking her eyes and gums, watching how she moved. "She's gaining weight already. That's good, but you need to let her move more during the day. Don't keep her penned all the time. She needs exercise to develop properly, needs to explore and play." "Yes, ma'am. I'll remember that. And her hooves will need attention soon. Come by tomorrow, and I'll show you how to trim them. It's not hard, but you have to do it right, or you can cause problems." Silas listened and learned, grateful for her knowledge and her willingness to share it. Each day she taught him something new: how to check for fever, how to encourage a reluctant feeder, what plants were safe for donkeys to eat, and which ones were poisonous. She was gruff and direct, never wasting words, but underneath the tough exterior he could sense genuine care for animals and grudging approval of his efforts. The days fell into a rhythm. Silas woke before dawn to feed Mercy, then rode to Martha's for fresh milk, while the foal stayed in the corral. He spent the middle of the day working on the homestead, fixing things that were broken, building things that were needed, making the place more livable. Every 3 to 4 hours he stopped whatever he was doing to feed Mercy, and she came running at the sound of the bottle being prepared, her enthusiasm never wavering. In the evenings, after the last feeding, he sat by the fire and read Martha's book, or just watched the stars appear one by one. Mercy often lay beside him during these quiet hours, her head resting on his knee, content to be close. Dusty grazed nearby, and the creek whispered its endless song, and Silas felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. Not the peace of giving up, but the peace of finding a place to rest. The cabin became more than just shelter. It became a project, a purpose, a reason to think about tomorrow. Silas repaired the broken window using glass he scavenged from an old truck frame he found in a gully. He fixed the table and chair, making them sturdy again. He cleared brush from around the spring that fed the creek and dug a proper channel to direct water where it was needed. He rebuilt the corral fence to be stronger and safer, working slowly and carefully, taking satisfaction in work well done. He discovered that raising Mercy required constant attention. She needed feeding every 4 hours, cleaning up after, monitoring for signs of illness, and enough interaction to keep her from becoming stressed or lonely. It was exhausting work, especially for a man his age whose body protested every morning when he got up, but he found himself grateful for it. The routine gave structure to his days, and Mercy's presence filled the silence he'd grown too accustomed to. The foal grew quickly, her legs lengthening, her fuzzy baby coat giving way to sleeker hair. Her personality emerged too. She was curious and bold and stubborn in that particular way. Donkeys have, refusing to be pushed, but willing to follow if you asked nicely. She followed Silas everywhere he went, braying indignantly if he tried to leave her behind, even for a moment. When he sat by the fire at night, she lay beside him, and when he worked during the day, she watched with interest or found her own entertainment chasing butterflies and investigating interesting smells. 3 weeks after finding Mercy, Martha handed him the milk jugs and said, "She's doing well, better than I expected, to be honest. Thanks." I think that wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, but there was warmth in her voice that hadn't been there in the beginning. "She'll need to start on solid food soon. Bring her by tomorrow, and I'll show you how to introduce it without making her sick. Donkeys have sensitive digestive systems, and you have to transition them carefully." Silas nodded, filing away this information with everything else he'd learned. His head was full of knowledge about donkeys now, things he'd never thought he'd need to know, but that had become essential to keeping Mercy alive and healthy. As he rode back to the homestead that evening, milk jugs secured behind his saddle and Mercy trotting alongside Dusty with growing confidence, Silas realized something important. He'd been at the homestead for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in one place, the longest he'd stayed anywhere since leaving his ranch. He'd been so focused on Mercy and the daily routines that he hadn't thought about moving on, about drifting west, about any of the vague plans he'd had when he first started riding. The homestead had become home without him noticing. The cabin was comfortable now, warm and dry, with a good fireplace and his few possessions arranged on. The shelves, the corral kept Mercy safe at night, the creek provided fresh water, and the valley offered enough grazing for Dusty. He knew the land now, where the best shade was during the hot afternoons, which paths were easiest to walk, where the birds nested and the rabbits ran. He'd stopped drifting, he'd stopped running, and the surprising thing was, he didn't mind. The grief was still there, still present in quiet moments when he thought of Clara or remembered better times, but it didn't crush him anymore. It was just part of him now, something he carried, but that didn't define everything he was or would be. That night, sitting by the fire with Mercy dozing against his leg and the stars bright overhead, Silas pulled out paper and a pencil he'd bought from Henry's store. The paper was rough and cheap, and the pencil needed sharpening, but it would do. He sat for a long time trying to figure out what to say, how to bridge 5 years of silence and pain. Finally, he started writing. "Dear Emily, I know it's been a long time since we've talked. Too long, I'm sorry for that. After your mother died, I didn't handle things well. I shut down. Shut everyone out, including you. Especially you. That wasn't fair. And I'm sorry. I've been traveling for the last 6 months, trying to figure some things out. Trying to figure out how to live in a world where your mother isn't here anymore. I sold the ranch and most everything else, packed what I could carry, and just started riding. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe just a way to keep moving so I didn't have to think too much. But something happened that changed things. I found a donkey foal in the desert, orphaned and dying beside her dead mother. I should have left her there. That would have been the practical thing, the sensible thing. But I couldn't do it. So I took her with me. And now I'm raising her. Her name is Mercy, and she's taught me something I'd forgotten, that caring about something is worth the risk of losing it. I'm staying at an old homestead outside a small town called Redemption. I've fixed the place up some, made it livable. There's a good creek and decent grazing, and the people here have been kind in that quiet way country folks are. I don't know how long I'll stay, but for now it feels right. For now, I'm not running anymore. I wanted you to know I'm okay. More than okay, really. I'm starting to feel like myself again, like the man I was before grief took over everything. And I wanted you to know I think about you and Jake and the kids. I've missed so much of their lives, and that's my fault. I wasn't strong enough to be part of things when your mother died, and by the time I could breathe again, too much time had passed. I know I haven't been much of a father these last years. I know I let you down when you needed me most. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to do better. I'd like to hear about your life, about Sophie and Michael, about what's happening in Seattle. You don't have to write back if you don't want to. I'd understand that. But I hope you will. If you want to write, you can send letters to Henry Marsh's general store in Redemption. He'll hold them for me. The address is at the bottom of this page. I'm learning something from Mercy, that it's never too late to start over, to care about something again, to try even when you're not sure how it'll turn out. Maybe it's not too late for us either. I love you, Emily. I should have said that more often when you were growing up, should have said it after your mother died. But I'm saying it now, and I mean it with everything I have. Your father, Silas. He read the letter over 3 times by firelight, nearly threw it away twice, then sealed it in an envelope before he could change his mind again. His handwriting was shaky and unpracticed. He hadn't written more than a signature in years, but it would have to do. The words were what mattered, not how they looked on the page. The next morning, after feeding Mercy and checking on Dusty, he rode into Redemption. It was early enough that the main street was still quiet, just a few people moving about their business. He found Henry sweeping the porch of his store again, that same ritual he performed every morning, whether it needed doing or not. "Morning, Silas. How's that foal of yours? Growing like a weed, eating me out of house and home." Silas pulled the letter from his pocket. "I need to mail this. Would you know the postage to Seattle?" Henry took the envelope and examined the address, then looked up at Silas with something soft in his eyes. "Understanding, maybe, or approval? I'll take care of it. Should get there in a few days." "I appreciate that." Silas counted out coins for the postage. "Good for you," Henry said quietly, not asking questions but making it clear he knew this was important. He set the letter aside where it wouldn't get lost. "Mail goes out this afternoon. She'll have it by week's end." Silas nodded, feeling lighter somehow. He'd done something hard, reached out across years of silence and pain. Now all he could do was wait and see if Emily reached back. He stopped at the diner on his way out of town, drawn by the smell of coffee and bacon. The place was small and clean, with a counter and a handful of tables, photographs of old Redemption on the walls. A woman with grey hair, pulled into a neat bun, looked up from wiping down the counter. "You must be Silas. Henry told me about you and your donkey. I'm Dorothy Grant." Her smile was warm and genuine. "Sit anywhere you like. Coffee? Please." She brought him coffee in a thick ceramic mug and took his order: eggs, bacon, toast. While she cooked, she talked about the town, about Henry, about the people who lived here. Her granddaughter Lily was 8, and animal crazy apparently. Would love to meet Mercy sometime if Silas didn't mind. She's welcome to visit. Silas found himself saying, "The foal could use the attention, and I could use the company." Dorothy's smile widened. "I'll tell her. She'll be over the moon." The food, when it came, was simple and good, cooked the way his mother used to cook, with care and without fuss. Silas ate slowly, savoring each bite. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed sitting in a diner, being around people, having someone to talk to, even about nothing in particular. When he tried to pay, Dorothy waved him off. "First meal's on the house. You come back, though. You pay like everyone else." "That's kind of you." "Not kind. Just how we do things here. You're part of the community now, whether you planned on it or not." Silas left feeling something he hadn't felt in years, connected. Like he belonged somewhere, even if he hadn't meant to belong, even if it had happened by accident while he was focused on keeping a foal alive. The days continued their rhythm. Mercy grew stronger and more confident, her personality emerging in ways that delighted and exasperated Silas in equal measure. She developed opinions about everything: what food she preferred, which paths she liked to walk, where she wanted to sleep. She was affectionate but independent, demanding attention on her terms and wandering off to explore when Silas thought she should stay close. She also developed a fondness for mischief. She learned how to open the corral gate with her nose, figured out the simple latch mechanism through trial and error. Silas would wake in the morning to find her grazing beside Dusty, having let herself out in the night. She discovered that she could knock over water buckets and seemed to think it was hilarious, braying with what sounded like laughter. She stole tools from his work area, a hammer, a wrench, a coil of wire, and hid them in unlikely places, like she was playing some kind of game only she understood. But she also learned quickly the things Silas taught her. She came when called, responding to his voice even from a distance. She stood still for grooming, enjoying the brush running through her coat. She followed on a lead line without pulling, having learned that cooperation made everything easier. She learned trust, and she gave it freely, the way only an animal who's been saved can trust its savior completely and without reservation. Silas found himself talking to her constantly, narrating his day, telling her about memories of Clara, about Emily, and the grandchildren he barely knew. Mercy listened with her ears forward, occasionally braying in response, and Silas didn't feel foolish talking to a donkey. She was better company than most people. Honestly, she didn't judge, didn't offer unwanted advice, just listened and was present. Martha noticed the change in him during one of his milk runs. She'd been teaching him about donkey care for weeks now, how to check for health problems, what kind of exercise Mercy needed at different stages, how to deal with the stubbornness inherent in the species. That day, she handed him the milk jugs and studied him with those sharp eyes that didn't miss much. "You look better." "Better than what?" "Than when you first showed up here. You looked like a man trying to die, like you'd given up on everything including yourself. Now you look like a man trying to live." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. Silas didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she was right. He had been trying to die in a slow, passive way, just drifting until there was nothing left. And now he was trying to live, trying to build something, trying to care again. "It's a good look on you," Martha said, allowing herself a small smile. "Keep it." 2 weeks after he'd mailed the letter, Silas was in town getting supplies, allowing herself a small smile. "Keep it." 2 weeks after he'd mailed the letter, Silas was in town getting supplies when Henry called him over with an unusual expression on his face. "Excitement, maybe, or satisfaction. Got something for you." Henry pulled an envelope from under the counter. "Came this morning." Silas recognized Emily's handwriting on the envelope, and his hands shook slightly as he took it. He stood there in the store, holding it, afraid to open it, and afraid not to. "Go on," Henry said gently. "Whatever it says, it's better to know." Silas opened the envelope carefully, pulled out 2 sheets of paper covered in Emily's neat handwriting. His eyes blurred as he read, and he had to wipe them to keep reading. "Dad, I got your letter. I've read it about a dozen times, and I'm still not sure what to say. I'm glad you wrote. I'm glad you're okay. To be honest, I wasn't sure you were. When you stopped answering my calls after Mom died, when you sold everything and disappeared, I thought maybe you decided you were done with everything, including me. I'm sorry. I know I left home angry and didn't come back much. I know Mum was always the bridge between us, and when she was gone, we didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. I should have tried harder, should have pushed more, should have refused to let you disappear, but I didn't know how to help someone who didn't want to be helped. A donkey named Mercy. Mom would have loved that. She always said you had a soft heart under all that cowboy gruffness, even when you couldn't show it or didn't know how to. She said you felt things deeper than most people, you just didn't have the words for it. Jake and I are doing well. The kids are good. Sophie is 10 now, and Michael is 8. They ask about their grandpa sometimes, and I never know what to tell them. That you're out there somewhere, living your life. That you and I don't know how to be a family anymore. It's hard to explain to children why their grandfather isn't part of their lives. Maybe that can change. I'd like it to change. I'd like for you to know them, and for them to know you. I'd like for us to figure out how to talk to each other without Mom there to translate. I'm sending you some photos of the kids. Sophie looks like Mom, especially around the eyes. You'll see it right away. Michael has your stubborn streak, won't quit at anything once he's started, even when it would be smarter to give up. He gets that from you. I don't know what else to say except I miss you, and I'm glad you wrote. Write back if you want. Tell me about Mercy. Tell me about this town and the people you've met. Tell me about what you're doing and thinking. Tell me something, anything. Let's try to be a family again, even if we don't know exactly how. Love, Emily. 2 photographs fluttered to the counter. Silas picked them up with trembling hands. Sophie stood in front of a school, backpack on her shoulders, smiling at the camera. She did have Clara's eyes, that same warmth and intelligence. Michael was caught mid-motion on a soccer field, all energy and determination, his face set in concentration. His grandchildren, growing up without him, becoming people he didn't know. The loss of that hit him hard, but underneath the loss was something else. Possibility. The chance to change things, to be part of their lives, to not let grief steal everything. He read Emily's letter 3 more times, standing there in Henry's store, and by the 3rd time he had to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand because he couldn't see the words through his tears. Henry busied himself with inventory, arranging cans on shelves that didn't need arranging, giving Silas privacy without leaving him alone. It was a kindness Silas wouldn't forget. When he could speak again, Silas folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket with the photographs. "I need to write her back. Can I get paper and stamps? Take what you need." "No charge." Henry's voice was gentle. "Some things are more important than money." That night, after Mercy was fed and settled and the fire burned low, Silas sat at the table in the cabin and wrote by lantern light. The words came easier this time, flowing onto the paper like water, finding its path downhill. "Emily, your letter meant more than I can put into words. Thank you for writing back. Thank you for giving me another chance. You're right that your mother was the bridge between us. I relied on her to translate my feelings because I never learned how to do it myself. Growing up the way I did, you didn't talk about feelings much. You just worked hard and hoped people understood what you couldn't say. But that's not fair to you. And it wasn't fair to your mother either. She deserved better, and so do you. I'm sorry for shutting you out after she died. I was drowning, and I didn't know how to ask for help or how to accept it when it was offered. I thought the only way through was to keep moving, but all I did was run in circles, getting nowhere. I was lost, Emily, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Mercy is doing well. She's 5 months old now and thinks she's queen of the world. She's stubborn and curious and demands attention every waking moment. She's learned how to open the corral gate and lets herself out whenever she wants. She steals my tools and hides them like it's a game. But she's also sweet and affectionate, and she's taught me something important, that it's possible to care about something again without it destroying you when things go wrong. Your mother would have adored her. She would have been out here every day with apples and carrots, spoiling her rotten. She would have made me build a better shelter and probably would have sewn some kind of blanket for cold nights. She always knew how to take care of things, including me. I'm living at an old homestead outside a town called Redemption. The name still makes me smile. Of all the places to end up, right? The cabin's small but comfortable. I've fixed it up, made it solid. There's a good creek and grazing for my horse, Dusty. The people here have been kind. Henry, who runs the store, Martha, who sells me milk for Mercy, Dorothy, who runs the beast diner. They've made me feel welcome without pushing, and that's meant more than they probably know. I look at Sophie and Michael's photos every day. I hung them on the cabin wall where I can see them first thing in the morning. Sophie does have your mother's eyes. I see Clara in that smile, in the way she's standing with such confidence. And Michael, yes, he's got my stubbornness. I hope that serves him better than it served me sometimes. Stubbornness can be strength or it can be foolishness, depending on when you use it. I'd like to hear more about them. What are they interested in? What makes them laugh? What are their favorite subjects in school? I know I haven't been part of their lives, and that's my fault. But I'd like to change that if you'll let me. I'd like to be a grandfather to them, even if I'm starting late. I'm learning something important out here. I'm learning that it's never too late to start over, to care about something again, to try even when you're not sure how things will turn out. Maybe it's not too late for us either. Maybe we can build something new, something that honors your mother's memory but doesn't live entirely in her shadow. Write when you can. Tell me about your life, about Jake, about the kids. I want to know everything, the big stuff and the small stuff, the exciting things and the ordinary days. I want to catch up on the years I missed, and I want to be part of what comes next. I love you, Emily. I should have said it more when you were young, should have shown it better. But I'm saying it now, and I'll keep saying it as long as you'll let me. Your dad, He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail in the morning. Then he sat at the table, looking at the photographs in the lantern light. Sophie with Clara's eyes, Michael with his stubbornness, his grandchildren, growing up, becoming themselves. He'd missed so much already, first words, first days of school, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. But maybe he could be there for what came next. Maybe it wasn't too late. The photographs went up on the cabin wall, secured with small nails. He positioned them where he'd see them every morning when he woke up, a reminder of what he'd almost lost and what he was working to regain. Mercy continued to thrive. By her 6th week, she was eating grain mixed with hay, drinking less milk, her diet transitioning the way Martha had taught him. She followed Dusty around like the mare was her real mother, and Dusty tolerated it with patient resignation, occasionally nuzzling the foal's neck when Mercy pressed close, seeking comfort or warmth. Silas introduced Mercy to a proper halter, teaching her to lead with the same patience he'd used for decades with horses. She fought it at first, pulling back and shaking her head, protesting this new constraint on her freedom. But Silas persisted without forcing, rewarding the smallest cooperation, never losing his temper or his patience. Eventually she accepted it, learned that the halter meant walks and exploration, meant going places with Silas rather than being left behind. They walked together around the homestead every evening after the heat broke, Mercy prancing and exploring while Silas let her set the pace. She investigated everything, new plants, interesting rocks, bird nests in low bushes, the play of light on water. Her curiosity was boundless, and Silas found himself seeing the world through her eyes, noticing details he'd long stopped paying attention to. The way juniper berries changed color as they ripened. The pattern of tracks in the dust showing what animals came to the creek at night. The particular quality of light just before sunset that made everything glow. The work on the cabin and corral expanded beyond simple repairs. Silas found himself building a proper shelter for Dusty and Mercy, with a roof that would keep off rain and walls to block winter wind. He didn't plan it consciously, it just happened, one board at a time. Because the animals needed it, and he had the skills and the time. Each piece of lumber he placed felt like a commitment to staying, to building something that would last beyond tomorrow or next week. He fell into a routine of visiting town once a week for supplies. The faces became more than just familiar, they became friends, or something close to it. Henry always had time to talk, whether about the weather or politics or just the small happenings of a small town. Dorothy served him pie with his coffee and shared stories about her granddaughter Lily. The postmaster learned to save Emily's letters for him, handing them over with a knowing smile. The old men who sat on benches outside the barber shop nodded greetings and made room when he passed. It was strange, feeling like he belonged somewhere again. Strange but not unwelcome. He'd spent so long on the outside of things, watching other people's lives from a distance, that being included felt foreign. But he found himself accepting it, even welcoming it, letting these people into his life in small ways. The letters with Emily became regular, arriving every week or two. She wrote about her work as a school counselor, helping teenagers navigate problems that seemed enormous to them. She wrote about Jake's projects. He designed software for medical devices, something Silas didn't entirely understand but could appreciate the importance of. She wrote about Sophie's love of reading, how she went through books like Silas went through coffee. She wrote about Michael's determination to make the soccer team, practicing every day after school until it was too dark to see the ball. She sent more photos too, and Silas pinned them to the cabin wall beside the first ones. Sophie at a piano recital, her expression serious and focused. Michael covered in mud after a game, grinning like he'd won the World Cup. Emily and Jake together, older now but still clearly in love. A family Silas had missed being part of, but maybe could rejoin if he kept trying. He wrote back about Mercy's progress, about the work on the homestead, about the quiet satisfaction of fixing things with his own hands. He wrote about Martha's gruff kindness and Henry's steady friendship. He wrote about Clara sometimes. Memories that came easier now, less painful. Emily responded with her own memories, and slowly they built a bridge across the years of silence, plank by plank, word by word. In one letter, Emily wrote something that stopped him cold. The kids want to visit. Sophie keeps asking about Mercy, and Michael wants to learn to ride. Would that be okay? Maybe in the spring when school's out? Silas read that paragraph 5 times, his heart racing. The idea of them coming here, seeing what he'd built, meeting Mercy, spending time together, it felt enormous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. He could show them the homestead, teach Michael to ride Dusty, let Sophie help care for Mercy. They could sit by the fire in the evenings and talk, really talk, building relationships that should have been built years ago. He wrote back immediately, "I'd like that very much. More than I can say. Spring would be perfect. The desert blooms then, and it's beautiful. Come stay as long as you want. We'll have plenty of room, and Mercy will love having visitors." After he sealed that letter, he sat for a long time just looking at the photographs on his wall. His daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchildren. Coming here, to see him, to spend time with him. The possibility filled him with something he'd almost forgotten: anticipation, hope, the sense that good things might still happen if he was patient and kept trying. That night, he fed Mercy her evening bottle and told her, "You're going to have visitors in the spring, kids who'll spoil you rotten and probably teach you bad habits. What do you think about that?" Mercy brayed enthusiastically, as if she understood and approved, and Silas laughed. The sound surprised him again, laughter coming easier now, more natural, like a skill he was relearning after years of disuse. Outside, the stars came out one by one, and the creek sang its patient song, and Silas sat with Mercy beside him, feeling something he'd thought was lost forever. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too much to ask, too bright a word for a life that still held grief and regrets. But contentment, peace, the sense that things were moving in the right direction, that he was building toward something, instead of just drifting away from everything. The photographs watched from the cabin wall, and Silas made them a silent promise. He would be there when Emily and her family came. He would be present, engaged, the grandfather these children deserved. He would make up for lost time however he could, and he would not let grief or fear or old habits steal this second chance he'd been given. Mercy fell asleep against his leg, trusting and content, and Silas rested, his hand on her warm side, feeling her breathe. Two lost creatures who'd found each other in the desert, both surviving, both healing, both learning that caring about something was worth whatever risks came with it. "Thank you," he whispered to Mercy, to Clara's memory, to whatever forces had led him to that spot in the desert at exactly the right moment. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The fire burned low, and the night deepened, and Silas sat watching the stars wheel overhead, at peace. Winter came to the high desert gradually, announced by shorter days and cooler nights that required a fire in the cabin's fireplace. Silas insulated the cabin better, cutting and stacking firewood until he had a good supply, making sure both his shelter and the animals' shelter were ready for whatever the season might bring. He'd lived through enough desert winters to know they could be harsh despite what outsiders thought. Mercy had grown a thick winter coat, her body adapting to the changing temperatures with the resilience of youth. She seemed to delight in the cooler weather, bounding through the first snow that fell, just a dusting, barely enough to count, but she treated it like a miracle, kicking her heels and braying at the sky with pure joy. The town's annual spring festival was still months away, but Henry mentioned it one day when Silas stopped by for supplies. "It's a small affair," Henry explained, "but the whole community turns out, food, music, a parade down Main Street. You and Mercy should come. Folks would enjoy seeing her all grown up and healthy." Silas had dismissed the idea at first. Crowds and celebration weren't his style, and he had work to do at the homestead. But as winter settled in, and he thought more about Emily's visit planned for spring, he reconsidered. She'd want to see the town, meet the people who'd helped him. Maybe attending the festival would be a good way to show her he'd found a community here, that he wasn't just isolated and alone. The letters with Emily continued through the winter, arriving regularly, despite occasional snow that delayed the mail. She wrote about holidays with the kids, about Jake's parents visiting from California, about Sophie's school play, and Michael finally making the soccer team. She sent photos of Christmas morning, the kids surrounded by presents, their faces glowing with happiness. Silas pinned those photos to his wall with the others, his gallery of missed moments and future possibilities. He wrote back about Mercy's progress. She was 8 months old now, nearly full-grown, sturdy and strong with intelligent eyes, and a personality that filled any space she entered. He wrote about the quiet satisfaction of winter evenings by the fire, about reading Martha's book yet again, and learning new things each time. He wrote about his plans for spring, about fixing up the homestead even more before their visit. In February, something unexpected happened. Silas was in town picking up mail when Martha found him outside Henry's store. She wasn't alone. 2 women flanked her, both ranchers by the look of them, weathered and capable in the way of people who'd spent their lives working outdoors. "Silas, these are the Connolly sisters," Martha said. "May and Ruth. They've got a ranch about 15 miles south of here. I told them about you and how you've handled Mercy. They'd like to talk to you about something." May, the older sister with grey streaks in her dark hair, got straight to business. "We've been watching how you work with that donkey. Martha speaks highly of your patience and skill, says you learn quick and don't give up when things get difficult. We've got a cattle operation that needs managing come fall, and we could use someone who knows what they're doing. The pay's not much, but it's steady work. There's a foreman's cabin on the property bigger than that homestead you're at, with electricity and running water. You could bring your animals, set up proper, if you're interested in something more permanent than squatting in an abandoned cabin, that is." Silas stared at them, caught completely off guard. A job offer, real work with real pay, security, a proper home, a reason to stay that went beyond just Mercy and waiting for Emily's visit. "That's generous of you," he managed. "But I should tell you, I'm 73 years old. Not sure I'm what you're looking for in a ranch foreman." Ruth, the younger sister with sun-weathered skin and sharp eyes, smiled. "We're not looking for someone to wrestle steers. We need someone with experience and judgment, someone who can manage seasonal hands and make good decisions. Age doesn't matter if you can do the work, can you? Could he?" Silas thought about it honestly. His knees ached in the mornings and his back wasn't what it used to be, but he was still strong, still capable. He knew cattle and horses, knew ranch management, had been doing this kind of work his whole life. The physical demands would be less than running his own place had been. "I could do the work," he said carefully, "but I'd need to think about it. Can I have some time?" "Take all the time you need," May said. "Offer stands until you decide otherwise. We're not going anywhere, and we're not in a rush. Talk it over with whoever you need to talk to. Let us know when you're ready." After they left, Henry leaned on his broom and studied Silas with those knowing eyes. "That's a good offer. The Connollys are fair people, and that foreman's cabin is solid. You'd be set for as long as you wanted to stay." "I know." Silas felt unsettled, uncertain. 6 months ago, he would have said no without thinking twice. Jobs meant commitment, meant staying in one place, meant putting down roots that might get torn up. But now, with Mercy depending on him, with Emily planning to visit, with connections forming in this community, he wasn't sure. "What's holding you back?" Henry asked, not pushy, but genuinely curious. "I don't know. Fear, maybe. Fear that if I settle, if I commit, something will happen and I'll lose it all again. Fear that I'm not done running, even though I've stopped moving." Henry nodded slowly. "That's honest, at least. But you know, Silas, you're going to lose things regardless. That's life. The question is whether you're going to let fear of loss stop you from having anything worth losing in the first place." Silas carried those words back to the homestead and sat with them for days. He fed Mercy and cared for Dusty and worked on the cabin, but his mind kept circling back to the job offer. Steady work, a real home, integration into the community. All the things he'd thought he didn't want, didn't need, didn't deserve. He wrote to Emily about it, laying out the details and his uncertainty. Her response came faster than usual, just a week later. "Dad, take the job. This isn't even a question. It's exactly what you need, work you're good at. A community that values you, stability for you and Mercy. Why are you hesitating? I think I know why, and I'm going to be direct with you because someone needs to. You're scared. You're scared that if you build something, care about something, commit to something, it'll be taken away like Mom was taken away. You're scared that settling means being vulnerable again. But Dad, you're already vulnerable. You've already built something, that homestead. Your relationship with Mercy, friendships with Henry and Martha and the others, this tentative reconnection with me. You've already committed, even if you won't admit it to yourself. The only question is whether you're going to acknowledge it and build on it, or keep pretending you're just passing through. You saved Mercy, but from everything you've written, she saved you too. Don't waste that gift by being afraid to live. Mom wouldn't want that. I don't want that. And I don't think you want it either, or you wouldn't have written to me in the first place. Say yes to the job. Build a real life there. Let yourself belong. You deserve that, and so does everyone who cares about you. When we visit in spring, I want to see you settled and happy, not still running from your own shadow. Love, Emily. Silas read the letter sitting by the fire, Mercy dozing beside him as usual. Every word hit home, because every word was true. He was scared, scared of caring, scared of losing, scared of being hurt again. But he was also tired of being scared. Tired of half-living, of keeping one foot out the door, of treating everything as temporary when he'd already been here 6 months and had no intention of leaving. Emily was right. He'd already committed. He'd committed the moment he knelt beside that dead donkey and decided to save her foal. He'd committed when he wrote to Emily, when he started fixing up the homestead, when he let Henry and Martha and Dorothy into his life. The only thing holding him back now was his own fear, and he'd let fear control him for too long already. The next morning, he rode into town and found May Connolly at the feed store. "I'd like to accept your offer," he said without preamble. "When do you want me to start?" May's face broke into a genuine smile. "September would be good, after the worst of the summer heat. That gives you time to get settled, and us time to prepare the cabin. You'll need to see the property first, meet Ruth officially, go over expectations and responsibilities." "That's fair." They shook on it, her grip firm and confident, and Silas felt something settle inside him. Decision made, commitment accepted. No more drifting, no more pretending he was just passing through. This was home now, for better or worse. Henry clapped him on the shoulder when he heard the news. "Told you, you're one of us now, whether you like it or not." "I like it," Silas admitted, surprised to realize it was true. "I like it just fine." The winter passed into spring, the desert, transforming from brown and dormant to alive with color. Wildflowers bloomed in carpets of yellow and purple, covering the hills like someone had spilled paint across the landscape. The air warmed and softened, and Mercy seemed to grow more energetic with each passing day, ready for adventures and exploration. Silas prepared for Emily's visit with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. He deep-cleaned the cabin, fixed every small thing that needed fixing, made sure there would be comfortable places for everyone to sleep. He visited the Connolly ranch and saw the foreman's cabin larger than the homestead, well-maintained, with real amenities. He met Ruth properly, and they went over the job details, everything clear and straightforward. The town's spring festival arrived in late April, and this time Silas decided to attend. He cleaned up, saddled dusty, and rode into Redemption with Mercy trotting alongside. The young donkey was 10 months old now, almost fully grown, sleek and healthy, with a coat that shone in the sun. The main street had been decorated with colorful bunting and banners. Tables lined the sidewalks offering food and crafts, and a small stage at one end hosted a bluegrass band playing old familiar songs. Children ran between the displays, their laughter mixing with music and conversation. The whole town had turned out, it seemed, dressed in their best casual clothes and ready to celebrate spring. Silas tied Dusty near the general store and kept Mercy on a lead. Within minutes, a crowd gathered around the young donkey. Children petted her carefully, asking permission first, and adults asked questions about where she'd come from and how she'd grown. Mercy basked in the attention like she'd been born for it, gentle with the children, patient with the adults, clearly enjoying being the center of focus. Dorothy appeared with plates of food barbecue that smelled incredible and cornbread still warm from the oven. "I saved you the good stuff," she said, pressing a plate into his hands, "and extra for Mercy." She produced apple slices from her apron pocket, and Mercy took them delicately, munching happily. "You didn't have to do that," Silas protested. "I know, but you've become one of us, whether you meant to or not, and we take care of our own." Dorothy's smile was warm and knowing. That's how it works in small towns. You stop being a stranger and become family. Henry found him later, bringing a cold beer and settling on a bench beside him while they watched the festivities. "Town's taken to you," he observed. "More specifically, they've taken to your donkey. But that amounts to the same thing. She's easy to love," Silas admitted, watching Mercy charming a group of children. "So are you, turns out. Prickly at first, but worth the effort." Henry took a drink of his own beer. "Heard you accepted the Connolly job. Good decision." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the festival unfold around them. The band played, couples danced on the makeshift dance floor, children chased each other with sticky hands and bright faces. It was simple and genuine, the kind of celebration that big cities had forgotten, but small towns remembered and cherished. Martha appeared later with two women Silas recognized from seeing around town, both ranchers like the Connollys, both weathered by sun and work. "These are my neighbors," Martha said. "Wanted to welcome you properly now that you're staying." They talked about ranching and cattle and the challenges of the high desert. They welcomed him into their circle without fanfare, treating him like he'd always been there. And maybe in a way he had been, from the moment he chose to save Mercy instead of riding past. Emily's arrival date approached with the weight of both promise and uncertainty. Silas found himself checking the calendar more than necessary, counting down days, then hours. He'd talked to her on the phone twice. Henry had let him use the store's landline, and her voice had been warm and excited, talking about the drive from the airport, about what the kids wanted to do, about how she couldn't wait to see the homestead and meet Mercy properly. But beneath the excitement, Silas felt nervous in a way he couldn't quite name. What if the reality didn't live up to the letters? What if seeing each other in person brought back all the old tensions and silences? What if Sophie and Michael didn't like him, or didn't like the desert, or got bored after an hour? What if he'd built this reconciliation in his head into something bigger than what it actually was? Mercy sensed his mood and stayed closer than usual in the days before Emily's arrival, pressing against his leg when he sat by the fire, following him more insistently during the day. Animals knew things, could read emotions in ways humans had forgotten. She knew something was coming, something important to him, and she responded with patient companionship. The morning they were due to arrive, Silas woke before dawn, even though they wouldn't be there until afternoon. He fed Mercy and Dusty, then spent the morning doing work he'd already done, sweeping the cabin floor again, rearranging his few possessions, checking the corral fence for the third time. Nervous energy with nowhere to go. Around noon, he gave up on useful work and just sat on the bench outside the cabin, watching the dirt road that led to his property. Mercy grazed nearby, and Dusty stood in the shade of her shelter, tail swishing at flies. The sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, and Silas waited, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. At 2 o'clock, a rental car appeared in the distance, dust billowing behind it on the unpaved road. Silas stood without thinking. his hand suddenly uncertain about where to go. Mercy looked up from her grazing, ears forward with interest. The car stopped near the cabin, and the doors opened like a magic trick, revealing his family. Emily emerged first, and Silas felt his throat tighten. She was older than he remembered, her hair touched with grey at the temples, fine lines around her eyes. But her smile was exactly like Clara's, that same warmth that could light up a whole room. Jake unfolded from the driver's seat, tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses and kind eyes. And then the children. Sophie stepped out carefully, slender and serious, taking in the homestead with observant eyes that were indeed exactly like Clara's. Michael practically exploded from the back seat, all energy and barely contained excitement, looking around like he wanted to run in 6 directions at once. For a moment they all just stood there, looking at each other across 10 feet of dusty ground. Then Emily stepped forward, closing the distance, and Silas met her halfway. They hugged, and she felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just forgotten what it was like to hold his daughter after so many years. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Hi, baby girl." The old nickname came out without him thinking about it, and Emily's smile widened. Sophie and Michael hung back, suddenly shy despite their earlier enthusiasm, but then Mercy, bless her, brayed loudly and broke the tension. The sound echoed across the valley, unmistakable and cheerful, and Michael's eyes went wide. "Is that her? Is that Mercy?" "That's her," Silas confirmed. "You want to meet her properly?" What followed was 2 hours of introductions and excitement, and the kind of chaos that only happens when children discover something wonderful. Michael bonded with Mercy immediately, feeding her carrots from his hand and laughing when she nuzzled his pockets for more. Sophie was quieter but just as enchanted, brushing Mercy's coat with careful strokes and asking thoughtful questions about how to care for donkeys. Jake shook Silas's hand firmly and said, "Thank you for inviting us. Emily's been looking forward to this for months. Thank you for coming, for bringing them, for giving me another chance." "Family gets second chances," Jake said simply. "Sometimes third and fourth ones too, if we're lucky." They settled into the homestead like they'd always been there. Emily marveled at the cabin, at how much work Silas had put into making it comfortable and livable. The children explored everything with the boundless energy of youth, the creek, the corral, the hills beyond. That evening, they made dinner together around the fire outside. Simple food, but it tasted like celebration, like family. After the children were asleep in the tent, Jake had pitched near the cabin. Silas sat by the fire with Emily and Jake. The stars were out in force, brilliant and close, and the night was full of the soft sounds of desert evening, the creek, an owl calling, the wind in the juniper trees. "I'm sorry," Silas said quietly, the words he'd been practicing, "for shutting you out after your mother died. I didn't know how to be without her, and I made that your problem when it shouldn't have been." Emily was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Then she said, "I'm sorry too. I should have tried harder, should have pushed more, should have refused to let you disappear. We both made mistakes, Dad. We were both trying to deal with losing Mom, and we didn't know how to help each other. But we're here now." "Yeah, we're here now." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting firelight. "Tell me about the job offer. Henry mentioned it when we stopped at his store. Sounds like a good opportunity." Silas explained about the Connolly sisters, about the foreman position starting in September, about the cabin that would give him a real home with electricity and running water. Emily listened, then asked, "Why did you hesitate at first?" "Fear, I suppose. Fear that if I settled, if I committed to something permanent, I'd lose it all again. Fear that I wasn't done running, even though I'd stopped moving." "And what changed your mind?" Jake asked. "Your letter," Silas said to Emily. "You called me out on my fear, made me see I'd already committed whether I admitted it or not. Saved Mercy, started fixing this place, wrote to you, let people into my life. The only thing holding me back was refusing to acknowledge what I'd already done." Emily smiled, that warm, Clara-like smile. "Mom used to say you were brave about the big things, but scared of your own feelings. Sounds like you're working on that. Trying to. It doesn't come natural, but I'm trying. They talked long into the night, catching up on years of missed conversations. Emily told him about her work as a school counselor, about the teenagers she helped navigate problems that seemed enormous to them, but were really just part of growing up. She told him about Jake's projects designing medical device software, about Sophie's love of reading that had her going through books faster than they could supply them, about Michael's determination that had him practicing soccer until dark every single day. Jake shared stories about his own family, his parents in California, his brother who taught high school English. He talked about how he and Emily had met, about their wedding that Silas had attended but barely remembered because grief had made everything foggy and distant. Silas talked about Mercy, about the work on the homestead, about Martha's gruff kindness and Henry's steady friendship. He talked about Clara, memories flowing easier now, less painful. He told them about finding Mercy, crying over her dead mother, about the moment of decision when he could have ridden past but didn't. That decision changed everything, Emily said softly. That one choice to stop and care about something, even when it was hard, changed me, Silas agreed. Reminded me that caring about things is what makes us human, even when caring means risking loss. The visit stretched from the planned 3 days to a full week. There was too much to do, too much to see, too many moments to share. Silas taught Michael to ride Dusty, the boy's initial nervousness giving way to determination and then joy. Sophie helped with Mercy's care every morning, learning to mix, feed and check hooves, her quiet competence reminding Silas painfully and wonderfully of Clara. They visited Redemption together one afternoon, and the town welcomed Emily's family with genuine warmth. Dorothy made a special dinner at the diner, pulling out all her best dishes. Henry gave the kids candy from the store and told them stories about their grandfather. Martha showed Sophie how to milk goats, and the girl's face lit up with fascination. "You've found a real community here," Emily said that evening. "These people genuinely care about you." "Surprised me too," Silas admitted. "I came here expecting nothing, wanting nothing, but they wouldn't let me stay a stranger. They just pulled me in and made me part of things." One afternoon, Silas took them to see the Connolly Ranch and the foreman's cabin he'd be moving into. The cabin was indeed bigger and better than the homestead, with a proper kitchen and bathroom and enough space for visitors. May and Ruth were there, and they welcomed the family warmly, showing the kids the cattle and horses, answering their endless questions with patience. "You'll be comfortable here," Emily said, looking around the cabin. "This is a real home, Dad. Room for you and the animals and for us to visit." "That's what I'm thinking," Silas said. "Build something permanent. Put down roots. Stop acting like everything's temporary." On their last evening, after the children were in bed, Emily pulled out a small box she'd brought from Seattle. "I have something for you," she said, handing it to Silas. Inside was a photo in a simple wooden frame. Clara, taken maybe 5 years before she died, standing in their kitchen garden with dirt on her hands and a smile on her face. She looked happy and alive, and so much herself that Silas had to look away for a moment, blinking hard. "I thought you might want it," Emily said quietly, "for your new cabin, a reminder that she's still with us, still part of everything we do." "Thank you," Silas managed, his voice rough. "This means everything. She'd be so proud of you, Dad, of what you've done, who you've become again." "I know I am." They sat together in comfortable silence, the photo between them, the fire burning low, the stars wheeling overhead. 3 generations of family, or 4, counting Clara's presence in memory and resemblance connected across time and loss, and the hard work of rebuilding what had broken. The next morning came too soon. Goodbyes were said with tears and promises. Michael hugged Silas tight and said, "Grandpa, can we come back?" The word "grandpa" hit Silas like a physical thing, filling empty spaces he'd forgotten were there. "You're welcome anytime," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is your place too now, always." Sophie hugged him more gently but just as sincerely. "Take care of Mercy," she whispered, "and yourself." "I will." Both promises. Jake shook his hand and said, "You're doing good, Silas. Keep doing it." Emily hugged him, last and longest, and Silas held his daughter like he should have held her years ago, like he should have held her when Clara died, and they both needed it. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that more when you were growing up, should have shown it better." "You're saying it now," Emily replied. "That's what matters. We'll be back at Christmas, 2 weeks this time, and we're bringing Jake's parents. They want to meet you. I'd like that. I'd like that very much." They drove away in a cloud of dust, and Silas stood watching until the car disappeared from view. Then he turned to find Mercy standing beside him, her head pressed against his leg in that way she had when she knew he needed comfort. "Well, he said to her, scratching behind her ears, "Guess we're really staying. Guess we're really building something here." She brayed agreement, and they walked back to the homestead together. In a few months, he'd move to the Connolly Ranch and start his new job. In half a year, Emily and her family would return for Christmas. In the meantime, he had work to do, preparations to make, a life to build that was real and rooted and permanent. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Boone was looking forward to tomorrow, not with fear or dread or resignation, but with hope. Real hope. The kind that came from knowing you had people who cared about you and responsibilities worth meeting and a place where you belonged. The cabin waited, and Mercy needed feeding, and there was firewood to split and a fence to mend. Simple work, honest work, the kind that filled your days and gave them meaning. Silas got to it with a light heart, Clara's photo waiting to be hung in his new cabin, Emily's promise of return, something solid to hold on to. Life wasn't perfect. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had company now, love and purpose and connection and hope, and that made all the difference. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of change. Silas spent the last days at the homestead, packing his few possessions and preparing for the move to the Connolly Ranch. The cabin that had sheltered him through his healing looked smaller now, emptier, but he felt no sadness leaving it. This place had served its purpose, given him space to find himself again. Now it was time to move forward. May and Ruth helped with the move, arriving with a truck to transport his gear and the few pieces of furniture he'd accumulated. Mercy and Dusty walked behind, following the truck down the road to their new home. The foreman's cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the Connolly, spread hundreds of acres of high desert pasture where cattle grazed under. The endless sky. The cabin welcomed him with space and comfort. 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a stove and refrigerator, a bathroom with running water and a proper shower. Electricity that worked at the flip of a switch. After months in the primitive homestead, these amenities felt like luxury. He hung Clara's photo in the main room, where he'd see it every morning, positioned the photos of Emily and the grandchildren beside it. His family, present, even when distant. The work started immediately. May and Ruth ran a tight operation, but a fair one, and they'd been honest about the demands. Silas would manage the daily operations, checking fence lines, monitoring the cattle herd, coordinating with seasonal hands during roundup and branding. He'd handle the 1,000 small crises that arose on any working ranch, make decisions about grazing, rotation and water management, keep the place running smooth. It was hard work, demanding work, but Silas found he'd missed it. Missed the purposeful exhaustion of a full day's labor, the satisfaction of problems solved and tasks completed. His body protested some mornings, reminding him he wasn't young anymore, but he'd pushed through. The work was worth the ache. Mercy adapted to ranch life with her usual bold curiosity. She explored every corner of the property, befriended the cattle with surprising effectiveness, and made herself indispensable in ways no one had expected. When Silas moved cattle from one pasture to another, Mercy walked alongside, her presence calming the nervous animals. She had a gift for it, an instinct that couldn't be taught. The Connolly sisters noticed and approved. "That donkey of yours is worth her weight in gold," Ruth said one evening after a successful cattle move. "Never seen animals settle so quick with a donkey walking point." She's special, Silas agreed, pride evident in his voice. The ranch hands were a mixed crew, some seasonal workers who came for specific jobs, some permanent, staff who'd been with the Connollys for years. They were curious about the new foreman at first, testing him with subtle challenges and careful observation. But Silas had been managing people and cattle for decades, and he knew how to earn respect without demanding it. He listened before he spoke, learned their names and their strengths, gave clear instructions and fair feedback. Within weeks, they'd accepted him as one of their own. Henry stopped by one afternoon in October, bringing mail and news from town. "You're settling in well," he observed, looking around the property with approval. "Connollys say you're the best foreman they've had in years. They're being generous. They're being honest. You know what you're doing, and you care about doing it right. That matters." Henry handed him a thick envelope. "From Seattle. Looks like Emily's been writing." The letter was long, full of details about daily life. Sophie had joined the school debate team and won her first competition. Michael had scored the winning goal in a crucial soccer match. Jake had gotten a promotion. Emily's work was challenging but rewarding, helping teenagers navigate the complicated business of growing up. They were all looking forward to Christmas at the ranch, already making plans. Silas wrote back that evening by lamplight, his letters to Emily now a regular rhythm. He told her about the ranch work, about Mercy's surprising talent with cattle, about the satisfaction of building something stable and permanent. He told her about the cabin that would have plenty of room for Christmas visitors, about his plans to cut a proper Christmas tree from the hills. He told her he was happy, truly happy, in a way he hadn't been since Clara died. The seasons turned as seasons do. Autumn brought cooler weather and the major work of preparing for winter, checking all the shelter structures, ensuring adequate feed supplies, making repairs before the cold settled in. Silas worked alongside the ranch hands, his experience evident in every decision, his leadership quiet but effective. Mercy turned 1 year old in November, and Silas marked the occasion with apples and a new halter that fit her adult size. She was magnificent now, fully grown, strong and healthy, with a coat that gleamed in the sun. She'd gone from a dying foal crying over her dead mother to this a confident, capable animal who'd found her purpose helping move cattle and keeping an old cowboy company. "We've come a long way," Silas told her that evening, brushing her coat until it shone. "Both of us. From the desert to here. From dying to living." She leaned into the brush, making that contented humming sound she made when she was happy, and Silas smiled. A year ago he'd been drifting toward nothing, ready to fade away. Now he had work that mattered, family coming for Christmas, a community that valued him, and this stubborn donkey who'd started it all by refusing to let him ride past. The donkey ranch stretched around them in the gathering darkness, solid and real and permanent. Home. Not the home he'd lost when Clara died, but a new home, built from choices and effort, and the willingness to try again. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything he'd thought he'd never have again. Christmas arrived with snow, rare for the high desert, but perfect for the holiday. Silas woke on December 20th to find the world transformed, white and clean and beautiful. The first substantial snow he'd seen since moving to the ranch, and it felt like a gift timed perfectly for Emily's family. They arrived 2 days before Christmas, driving carefully on roads made treacherous by ice. This time there were more of them: Emily, Jake, Sophie, and Michael, plus Jake's parents Tom and Linda, who'd driven down from California to meet Silas and see what their son had been describing in his emails. The cabin that had felt spacious for one person suddenly felt full in the best way. Sleeping. Bags and air mattresses covered the floors, the kitchen smelled of cooking, and the sound of voices and laughter filled every corner. Mercy stood outside the window watching the chaos with interested ears, and Silas felt his heart expand with something he'd almost forgotten: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Sophie and Michael had grown in the 6 months since their last visit. Sophie was taller, carrying herself with new confidence from her debate team success. Michael had filled out, stronger from his soccer training. They both ran to Silas when they arrived, hugging him without the shyness of their first meeting. He was grandpa now, fully and completely, and they'd missed him. Tom and Linda were warm and welcoming, treating Silas like family from the first handshake. Linda brought homemade cookies, and Tom brought stories about Jake's childhood that made everyone laugh. They fit into the group easily, and Silas found himself grateful for their presence, for the way they expanded his family circle. Christmas Eve, they all worked together to decorate the cabin. Strings of lights went up around the windows, pine branches brought in from the hills filled the rooms with their scent, and Sophie hung stockings above the fireplace with everyone's names carefully written in glitter. Michael helped Silas bring in the tree. He'd cut a scrubby juniper that would never win beauty contests, but was theirs, chosen together from the hills above the ranch. They decorated it with ornaments Emily had brought, and some handmade ones the kids had created specifically for this tree. A star made of tinfoil and cardboard went on top, and Michael insisted it was perfect even though it leaned slightly to one side. That evening, they gathered around the fireplace. May and Ruth had been invited and came bearing gifts, hand-knitted scarves for everyone, made by Ruth during the long winter evenings. Dorothy brought pie, and Henry arrived with a bottle of good whiskey for the adults, and special candies for the kids. Martha even showed up, gruff as ever, but with a soft smile when she saw the family gathered together. The cabin was crowded and warm, and full of the kind of chaos that only happens when people who love each other share space. Conversations overlapped, laughter rang out, children ran between adults' legs. Mercy stood outside the window like a sentry, occasionally braying to remind them she was there, and each time Michael ran out to give her treats and attention. Silas stood back for a moment, taking it all in. His daughter laughing with Linda, his grandchildren playing a card game with Tom, Jake and Henry discussing something technical that Silas didn't understand but appreciated their engagement. Martha and May talking about goats and cattle, Ruth showing Dorothy her knitting pattern. All these people brought together because one old cowboy had decided to save a dying foal in the desert. Clara's photo watched from the wall, her smile captured forever. In that kitchen garden moment, Silas raised his glass of whiskey toward it in a silent toast. Wish you were here, but thank you for them. Thank you for Emily. Thank you for teaching me that love is worth the risk. Christmas morning came with excited children and torn wrapping paper and gifts exchanged with thought and care. Sophie gave Silas a book about donkeys she'd researched and chosen herself. Michael presented a drawing he'd worked on for months, the whole family including Mercy, everyone together at the ranch. It was good, surprisingly good, capturing something true about the way they'd come together. Silas's gifts were simple, carved wooden animals he'd made in the evenings, each one unique. A horse for Michael, a book for Sophie, a decorative box for Emily, small things made with his own hands. They were received with genuine delight, valued not for their monetary worth, but for the time and thought they represented. The day unfolded in the lazy, comfortable way of the best holidays. Big breakfast, cooked by everyone helping, a walk in the snow where Mercy followed, and the kids threw snowballs, a dinner that took hours to prepare and minutes to devour. Evening games and stories around the fireplace. As night fell and the children finally crashed from exhaustion, the adults sat around the dying fire talking quietly. Emily leaned against Silas's shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "This is perfect, Dad. Exactly what I hoped for." "Me too, baby girl. Me too. Mum would love this. All of us together, you happy again, the kids knowing their grandpa." "She's here," Silas said quietly. "Can't you feel her? In the laughter, in the love, in all of us being together. She's here." Emily nodded, tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears, the kind that come when something that was broken finally feels whole again. Outside, the snow fell soft and steady, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. Mercy stood in her shelter, warm and safe. The cattle were bedded down for the night. The world was quiet except for the wind and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Inside the cabin, 3 generations of family, 4 counting Clara in memory and resemblance, were together. Not perfect, because families never are, but real and present, and choosing each other despite years of distance and pain. Silas looked around at the sleeping children, at Emily dozing against Jake, at Tom and Linda holding hands on the couch, his family, his community, his life, rebuilt from grief and loneliness into something beautiful and worth living. "Thank you," he whispered to Clara, to Mercy, to whatever forces had guided him to that spot in the desert a year ago. "Thank you for not letting me give up. Thank you for reminding me that life is worth living, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The fire burned low, and one by one everyone found their sleeping places. Silas was the last awake, sitting in his chair, looking at Clara's photo, and the photos of his grandchildren, and the chaos of gifts and decorations that proved beyond doubt that he was no longer alone. He'd started this journey broken and ready to fade away. He'd found a dying foal and made a choice to care when caring felt impossible. And that choice had led to this: a cabin full of family, a job that mattered, a community that valued him, a future that held promise instead of just emptiness. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected packages. Sometimes it comes as a small donkey braying in the desert, refusing to be ignored. Sometimes it comes as a choice to stop running and start building, to risk caring again, despite the certainty that loss will eventually come. Silas understood now what he hadn't understood a year ago. Life wasn't about avoiding pain or protecting yourself from loss. It was about showing up, caring anyway, loving despite the risk, building even when you knew time would eventually take everything away. It was about the moments between the laughter and the work, and the simple presence of people who mattered. He fell asleep in his chair with a smile on his face, surrounded by family, at peace for the first time in longer than he could remember. Outside, Mercy brayed once, a sound that carried across the snowy ranch like a benediction, like an amen, like a promise that tomorrow would come and they would face it together, the old cowboy and the stubborn donkey who'd saved each other when they both needed saving most. The years that followed brought their own rhythms and rewards, their own challenges and triumphs. Silas settled into his work at the Connolly Ranch with the ease of a man doing what he was meant to do. The cattle thrived under his management, the ranch hands respected his quiet leadership, and May and Ruth counted themselves fortunate to have found him. He wasn't just an employee, he was family, part of the fabric of their operation. Mercy grew into her role with equal grace. She was no longer just a pet or even just a working animal. She was a partner in the truest sense, intuitive and intelligent, able to read situations and respond with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. When cattle needed moving, she was there. When a new calf was nervous, her presence calmed it. The ranch hands joked that she was worth 3 good dogs and a case of beer, and they weren't entirely joking. Emily's family visited twice a year without fail, once in summer and once during the Christmas season. Each visit brought new stories, new growth, new connections forming and strengthening. Sophie graduated high school at the top of her class and headed to college with plans to study veterinary medicine. Michael earned a soccer scholarship and grew from a determined boy into a focused young man. They both knew their grandfather now, truly knew him, and he knew them. Jake's parents became regular visitors too, and the cabin that had once sheltered one lonely man now hosted gatherings of 15 or more during holidays. Silas added a covered porch to accommodate everyone, built with his own hands and the help of ranch hands who'd become friends. The porch became the heart of their gatherings, a place to sit and talk and watch the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Henry aged but remained sharp, still sweeping his porch every morning, still the unofficial mayor of redemption. Martha's hair went completely white, but her hands stayed steady and her knowledge of animals remained encyclopedic. Dorothy's granddaughter Lily grew up visiting the ranch regularly, drawn by Mercy and staying for Silas's patient teaching about animals and land management. She was 16 now and already planning to study agriculture in college. The community embraced Silas completely, and he let himself be embraced. He attended town meetings and harvest festivals, helped neighbors with difficult livestock, shared his knowledge freely. The man who'd come here, ready to disappear, had instead become a pillar of the community, someone people turned to for advice and help. 3 springs after that first Christmas, Emily called with news that brought Silas to tears. She was pregnant. At 46, it was unexpected, but she and Jake were thrilled. Silas would have another grandchild, another connection to the future, another reason to keep going strong. He stood in the barn that evening, brushing Mercy's coat and telling her the news. She was 4 years old now, in her prime, magnificent and strong. She listened with her ears forward, seeming to understand the importance of what he was saying. "Another baby," he told her. "Can you imagine? I'm going to be a grandfather again. Me, at my age, still getting to be part of new life beginning." She nuzzled his shoulder, warm and solid and real, and Silas felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. 4 years ago, he'd been ready to die. Now he was looking forward to holding a new grandchild, to teaching another small person about the world, to continuing the chain of love and knowledge that connected generations. The baby arrived in November, a girl they named Clara. When Emily sent the first photo, Silas sat in his cabin and cried openly, holding the picture of his new granddaughter with her great-grandmother's name. Clara's photo on the wall, watched as he held this new Clara in image form, and he felt the circle complete in a way that honored both the loss and the continuing life. He visited Seattle for the first time that winter, flying on an airplane at 77, despite his nervousness. Emily picked him up at the airport, and he met his newest grandchild in person, a tiny, perfect thing with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown like her great-grandmother's. He held her carefully, this miracle of continuation, and whispered promises he intended to keep. He'd be there for her like he'd learned to be there for Sophie and Michael. He'd be present, engaged, loving. The visit lasted 2 weeks, and Silas saw Emily's world properly for the first time. Her house, her neighborhood, her work at the school. He met her colleagues and friends, saw how respected and loved she was in her community. Pride filled him, pride mixed with regret for the years he'd missed, but mostly just pride. His daughter had built a good life, was raising good children, was making a difference in the world. Clara would have been so proud. Back at the ranch, life continued its steady rhythm. The seasons turned, the cattle moved from pasture to pasture. Mercy grew older with grace and dignity. Silas trained young ranch hands, passed on his knowledge, made sure what he knew wouldn't be lost. He wrote letters to all his grandchildren now, even baby Clara, storing up words for when she'd be old enough to read them. On warm evenings, he sat on his porch with Mercy grazing nearby, and Dusty, now 21, and retired, dozing in the shade. He watched. The sun set over the desert and thought about the journey that had brought him here. From grief and loss to purpose and connection. From a man ready to die to a man grateful for every morning. Sometimes Clara's presence felt so close he could almost hear her voice. Not the sad memory of her dying, but the vibrant reality of who she'd been. Her laughter, her warmth, her gift for seeing possibilities where he saw only problems. She was in Emily's smile, and Sophie's eyes, and baby Clara's name. She was in the love that connected them all across distance and time, and even death. Mercy brayed, and Silas smiled. 6 years since he'd found her crying over her dead mother in the desert. 6 years of healing and growth and learning to live again. She was his companion, his partner, his friend. The creature who'd refused to let him give up when giving up felt like the only option. "We did all right," he told her, and she walked over to press her head against his knee in agreement. "We did all right. You and me." The desert stretched around them in shades of purple and gold as the sun sank lower. The ranch was quiet, except for the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the cabin, photos covered the walls. Clara in her garden, Emily's family growing and changing, Mercy as a foal and as an adult, friends and community members captured in moments of joy. This was life, Silas understood now. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love. Not avoiding loss, but cherishing what you had while you had it. Not running from grief, but moving through it, towards something better, something worth building, something worth staying for. He'd come to the desert ready to fade away, and instead he'd found reasons to bloom. A foal who needed saving, a daughter who needed her father, grandchildren who needed their grandfather. A community that needed his knowledge and presence, work that mattered, and land that sustained, and love that healed even the deepest wounds. The stars came out one by one, familiar constellations wheeling across the sky. Somewhere in Seattle, Emily was probably putting baby Clara to bed. Somewhere in their respective colleges, Sophie and Michael were studying or sleeping or living their young lives. Somewhere in California, Tom and Linda were thinking about their next visit. Somewhere in Redemption, Henry was closing up his store, and Martha was feeding her goats, and Dorothy was wiping down her diner counters. All these people, connected to him now, part of his life, and he part of theirs. All because of one choice made in a moment of desperation and compassion. One decision to stop and care when every instinct said to keep riding. Silas Boone was 79 years old now, and he was finally, fully, completely alive. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had company. Love and purpose and connection and hope. The things that made life worth living, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Mercy lay down beside his chair, her breathing steady and peaceful. Above them, the stars burned bright and constant. Around them, the desert held its ancient silence. Within them, hearts beat with purpose and promise. This was home, this was family, this was life, messy and beautiful, and worth every moment of struggle it took to get here. And Silas wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Tomorrow would come with its demands and rewards. There would be work to do, animals to tend, phone calls with Emily, letters to write, a community to serve. There would be good days and hard days, laughter and tears, the full measure of a life fully lived. But tonight, he sat in peace, surrounded by evidence of love, grateful for second chances and stubborn donkeys who refused to let old cowboys fade away quietly. Grateful for life, in all its complicated glory, and for the courage to keep showing up, even when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. The wind whispered across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Mercy's breathing deepened into sleep. The stars wheeled overhead, patient and eternal. And Silas Boone, once broken, now healing, sat and watched it all with wonder and gratitude, alive in ways that mattered, part of something bigger than himself. This was his story. This was his redemption. This was his second chance, earned one small choice at a time, built from compassion and perseverance, and the simple refusal to